It was a crisp morning at a private airport. The sky was clear, with soft sunlight glinting off the polished metal of the jets parked neatly in their designated spots. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel, mixing with the chill of the early hours. Leila Hayes walked confidently toward the hangar, her elegant coat flowing with each step, like the steady rhythm of someone with purpose. Her leather briefcase, worn but classy, swung lightly at her side. Her face was calm, composed, almost unreadable. Her dark brown eyes flicked around the bustling tarmac, where flight crews were busy preparing for the day. Pilots moved with purpose. Mechanics checked engines, and attendants greeted passengers. Everything was orderly, almost mechanical. But for the guard standing near the stairs of a sleek private jet, Leila was just another person, one who, in his mind, did not belong here. He didn't notice the quiet confidence in her stride. He didn't pay attention to the quality of her coat or the way she carried herself. All he saw was her skin color and her simple appearance. And just like that, he made a decision about who she was. The guard, a middle-aged man with a gruff voice and a rigid posture, straightened up as Leila approached. He looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and condescension, the kind that comes from years of unchecked biases. "Ma'am," he said, stepping into her path. His tone was firm but laced with something else, an air of superiority. "You can't just walk up to that jet. This area is for VIPs only." Leila stopped in her tracks, her heels clicking softly against the concrete. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with a gaze that was both calm and piercing. Her expression didn't change, but there was a glint in her eyes that hinted at something deeper. For a moment, she said nothing. The guard mistook her silence for hesitation, a sign that his words had hit their mark. He smirked, folding his arms across his chest. "This is a private area," he continued, as if she hadn't understood him the first time. "The main terminal is back that way. Maybe you got lost." The jet behind him stood sleek and shiny, its engines humming softly, as if it were eager to take off. It was a symbol of power and exclusivity, a place where only the wealthiest and most influential people had access. The guard seemed determined to make sure Leila stayed far away from it. Leila's lips curled into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. She glanced down at the briefcase in her hand, then back up at the guard. "I appreciate your concern," she said, her voice smooth and even. "But I'm exactly where I need to be." The guard's smirk faltered for a split second before returning, even broader this time. He shook his head, as though amused by her response. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice slightly as if sharing a secret. "I'm not trying to be rude, but people like you don't usually fly on jets like these. Trust me, it's best if you head back to the main terminal." There it was, his assumption laid bare. "People like you." The words hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Leila's expression didn't change, but her grip on the briefcase tightened ever so slightly. She took a slow breath, letting the moment stretch out. Around them, the activity on the tarmac continued as if nothing unusual was happening. But for Leila and the guard, time seemed to stand still. "People like me," she repeated, her tone light, but with an edge of curiosity. She raised an eyebrow, inviting him to explain himself. The guard hesitated, realizing too late that he might have said too much. But instead of backtracking, he doubled down, his voice growing firmer. "Look, I don't make the rules," he said, gesturing toward the jet behind him. "This jet is for VIPs, very important people. Unless you're part of the crew or have some special permission, you can't be here." Leila's smile grew, though it was still faint and controlled. She adjusted the strap of her briefcase, her eyes never leaving the guard's face. "And what makes someone a VIP?" she asked, her voice calm and steady. The guard blinked, caught off guard by the question. He opened his mouth to answer but seemed to think better of it. Instead, he cleared his throat and glanced around, as if looking for someone to back him up. It's just the rules," he said finally, his voice less confident than before. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to make sure everything runs smoothly here." He took a step forward, as if to usher her away, but Lila didn't move. She stood her ground, her calm presence making him pause. "I understand," she said, her tone polite but firm. "Rules are important, but so is fairness. Don't you agree?" The guard frowned, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like her. As the seconds ticked by, a faint tension settled between them. The hum of the jet engines grew louder, filling the silence. Leela adjusted her grip on her briefcase and took a small step closer to the guard. Her movements were deliberate, measured. "I think," she said softly, "there's something you don't know about me." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that made the guard hesitate. He looked at her more closely now, searching for something he might have missed. But before he could speak, Leela's calm voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Why don't we clear this up?" she said, her tone still polite but with an unmistakable authority. "Would you like to call someone in charge?" The guard hesitated again, his confidence wavering. Something about Lila's demeanor, her poise, her unwavering gaze, made him doubt himself. Still, he didn't move. Instead, he folded his arms again and gave her a look that was meant to be intimidating. "I don't need to call anyone," he said gruffly. "I know how this works. You don't belong here." Lila's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet determination. She took another step forward, her coat swaying lightly in the breeze. "You're sure about that?" she asked, her voice calm but challenging. For the first time, the guard looked uncertain, and Leela knew she had him exactly where she wanted him. The guard's tone grew firmer as Leela remained silent, her quiet confidence unsettling him. He shifted his weight, squaring his shoulders as if to assert more control over the situation. "Look," he said, his voice carrying a sharper edge now, "I don't make the rules. If you're lost, the main terminal is that way." He pointed toward a distant building, his gesture dismissive, as though she were merely an inconvenience. Leela followed the direction of his pointing finger, her gaze resting briefly on the main terminal in the distance. Its bustling entrance was filled with travelers hurrying in and out, their bags wheeled across smooth floors. It was a stark contrast to the calm and exclusivity of the private jet area where they now stood. She returned her eyes to the guard, her expression unreadable. "I'm not lost," she said simply, her voice steady and polite. But the guard didn't seem to hear, or perhaps he didn't care to listen. His hand fell back to his side, and he gave a slight shake of his head, as though he were dealing with someone who just didn't understand how things worked here. Nearby, the scene was a stark reminder of the guard's bias. Passengers clad in designer suits strolled by, their luxury luggage trailing behind them. Some glanced briefly at the scene unfolding between Leela and the guard, but none stopped or seemed concerned. The guard's demeanor shifted noticeably when dealing with these passengers. His posture straightened, his tone became polite, almost deferential, as he offered smiles and nods to each person who passed. "Good morning, sir," he said to one man with a briefcase that gleamed in the sunlight. "Safe travels today." "Ma'am," he greeted a woman in oversized sunglasses, his voice courteous and smooth. Leela observed it all in silence, noting the stark difference in how the guard treated them compared to her. He didn't stop these passengers to question their presence or demand explanations. He didn't block their path or tell them they didn't belong. Her calm demeanor didn't waver, though inside, she felt the weight of every assumption the guard had made about her. His words, his actions, his dismissive tone, they all spoke volumes. "You must be mistaken," Leela said evenly, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. The guard's brow furrowed, his smirk fading slightly. He seemed momentarily thrown off by her composure, but he quickly recovered, his tone growing more rigid. "Mistaken," he repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice to a whisper as though sharing a secret. "Let me be clear," he said, his words sharp and deliberate. This jet isn't for people like you. The phrase hung in the air, heavy and unspoken for a moment. Lila's expression remained calm, but her eyes narrowed ever so slightly, the only indication that his words had registered. People like me, she echoed softly, her tone neutral but with an undercurrent of quiet strength. The guard hesitated for a fraction of a second, as though realizing he had said too much. But instead of retreating, he pressed on, his voice firm and his stance unyielding. Yes, he said, his eyes scanning her appearance once more, from her coat to her briefcase. You know what I mean. Lila tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. I'm not sure I do, she replied, her voice calm yet challenging. Why don't you explain it to me? The guard cleared his throat, suddenly looking uncomfortable. He glanced around, perhaps hoping for someone to step in and take over the conversation. But the tarmac was still, save for the distant hum of jet engines and the occasional footsteps of ground crew moving about their tasks. It's just the rules, he muttered, his confidence wavering slightly. This area is for VIPs. You need special permission to board a jet like this. Lila raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. And you've decided that I don't have permission? She asked, her tone polite but pointed. The guard faltered, his face flushing slightly. I'm just doing my job, he said defensively. And my job is to make sure that only the right people get access. Lila nodded slowly, as though considering his words. The right people, she repeated, her voice quiet but firm. And how do you decide who they are? The guard's discomfort grew, and he shifted awkwardly on his feet. Look, ma'am, I don't make the rules, he said again, his tone growing more irritated. I just follow them. Lila took a step closer, her presence calm but commanding. She looked directly into the guard's eyes, her gaze steady and unflinching. Following the rules is important, she said evenly. But so is understanding them, don't you think? The guard opened his mouth to respond but hesitated, as though unsure of what to say. Lila adjusted her grip on her briefcase, the soft leather creaking slightly under her fingers. Around them, the hum of activity on the tarmac continued, but the tension between the two was palpable. You're sure about this? She asked, her voice calm but carrying a weight that made the guard hesitate. He looked at her for a long moment, his smirk gone now. His posture was still rigid, but the confidence in his stance had wavered. Yes, he said finally, though his voice lacked the certainty it had carried before. I'm sure. Lila studied him for another moment before nodding slowly. Good, she said, her tone measured. Then I think it's time we clear this up. Her words hung in the air, a quiet challenge that the guard didn't quite know how to respond to. He shifted again, glancing around as though hoping someone else would intervene. But no one did, and Lila remained exactly where she was, her calm composure unshaken, her presence commanding without a single raised voice or sharp word. The guard's discomfort grew with each passing second, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. And in that silence, Lila's quiet strength spoke louder than anything else ever could. Lila took a deep breath, steadying herself. Every part of her wanted to respond sharply, to give the guard a piece of her mind for his arrogance and disrespect. But she had learned long ago that calmness could be far more powerful than anger. Instead of snapping back at him, she took a small step to the side, her movements deliberate and controlled. Slowly, she unlatched her briefcase, the soft click of the metal clasps breaking the tension-filled silence. The guard stood rigid, watching her every move. A smug smirk spread across his face, as though he had already won whatever battle he thought this was. To him, it seemed obvious. She would pull out an ID, some form of proof, and beg to. Lila didn't answer immediately. Instead, she raised a hand, her palm facing him in a subtle but commanding gesture that told him to wait. You see, she began, her voice steady and unhurried. There's something you should know before this goes any further. Her words hung in the air, each one deliberate and purposeful. The guard blinked, momentarily speechless. The authority in her tone caught him off guard. For the first time, he seemed unsure of himself, his earlier confidence faltering. Leela held up a single sheet of paper from the folder, turning it slightly so the guard could see the letterhead at the top. The logo was unmistakable. It belonged to the very airline whose jet stood gleaming behind him. "What's this supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice lower now, tinged with doubt. Leela didn't rush to explain. She let the moment stretch, watching as the guard's eyes darted between. "This moment," Leela said, her tone firm but measured, "is a chance for you to reflect, to learn. Because next time, there might not be someone like me to remind you that appearances can be deceiving." With that, she turned away, leaving the guard standing in stunned silence. As Leela walked toward the jet, the sunlight caught the gold lettering on her folder, a quiet reminder of the truth she carried with her every step. Leela handed the guard a single page from the sleek folder, her movements deliberate and calm. The paper fluttered slightly in the gentle breeze as the guard reached for it, his fingers hesitant, almost trembling. For a moment, he hesitated, as though he knew that whatever was written on that paper would change everything. The silence between them was deafening. Only the low hum of the jet's engines and the distant chatter of ground staff broke the stillness. The guard's eyes scanned the document. At first, his expression was one of mild curiosity, as if he were expecting to find nothing of importance. But as he read further, his face began to change. Confusion flashed across his features, quickly replaced by disbelief. Then came the shock. The letterhead at the top of the page was unmistakable, the logo of the very airline he worked for, bold and proud in navy and gold. His eyes traveled down the page, catching key phrases that made his stomach churn. CEO and majority owner, one-line rate. His gaze darted to the bottom of the document, where Leila's name was printed in bold, unmistakable font. "Leela Hayes," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. His mind raced to connect the dots, to comprehend how the woman he had just dismissed and disrespected could possibly hold such a title. Leela stood before him, her posture steady, her gaze calm but unyielding. She gave him a moment to process what he was reading, her silence speaking volumes. "I own this airline," she said finally, her voice cutting through the awkward silence like a knife. Each word was measured, deliberate, and sharp. "This is my jet, and you, sir, just tried to block me from boarding it." Her words landed with the force of a thunderclap. The guard's face drained of color, his earlier smugness replaced by visible panic. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he stood frozen, the weight of his mistake crashing down on him like a tidal wave. I didn't realize," he stammered, his words tumbling over each other. He clutched the paper in his hands, as if hoping it might somehow save him from the mess he had created. I didn't know." "That much is clear," Leela said, her tone sharp but controlled. She crossed her arms, her gaze steady and piercing. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to ask. Instead, you judged me based on what you assumed. Isn't that right?" The guard's face burned red with embarrassment. He looked down at the paper again, as if hoping it would say something different this time. But it didn't. The truth was written there in black and white, undeniable and final. "I'm so sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to." "To what?" Leela interrupted, her tone calm but firm. "You didn't mean to judge me, to assume I didn't belong here, to block me from boarding my own jet." Her questions hung in the air, each one hitting its mark. The guard shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado completely gone. I was just doing my job," he said weakly, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean any harm." Leela tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful but unwavering. "Doing your job," she repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the phrase. "Tell me, does your job involve making assumptions about people based on how they look?" The guard's eyes darted around, searching for an escape from her relentless gaze. "No, ma'am," he said quickly. Of course not. And yet that's exactly what you did, Leela said, her voice unwavering. Not just to me, but likely to others as well. How many people have you turned away? How many have you disrespected, simply because you assumed they didn't belong? The guard had no answer. He stared at the ground, his shoulders slumping under the weight of her words. Lila stepped closer, her calm demeanor somehow more intimidating than if she had raised her voice. This isn't just about me, she continued. It's about the culture you're creating, the message you're sending to others. And it's unacceptable. The guard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. I promise it won't happen again, he said, his voice barely audible. I've learned my lesson. Leela studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. I hope so, she said finally, because next time there might not be someone like me to hold you accountable. The guard nodded quickly, his face still pale. Yes, Mom. Thank you. I mean, I'm sorry. Lila didn't respond immediately. She reached out and took the paper back from him, sliding it neatly into her folder. Then, without another word, she turned and began walking toward the jet. Her steps were measured, her back straight, her presence commanding. The guard watched her go, his earlier arrogance completely shattered. He stood there, rooted to the spot, as the weight of his actions settled over him. As Leela approached the jet, the crew at the stairs straightened up, their postures respectful and professional. One of the attendants stepped forward, her expression warm and welcoming. Ms. Hayes, she said, her voice filled with genuine respect. Welcome aboard. Leela nodded, her calm expression softening slightly. Thank you, she said, her tone gracious but firm. As she ascended the stairs, the sun caught the gold lettering on her folder, a quiet reminder of the truth she carried with her. She didn't look back at the guard, who still stood frozen in place, but she knew the lesson she had delivered would not be forgotten. When she stepped into the jet's cabin, the atmosphere was one of calm luxury. Plush leather seats, soft lighting, and the faint scent of fresh flowers greeted her. The door closed behind her with a quiet hiss, sealing her in a world where she truly belonged, because she had built it herself. As the engines roared to life, Leela took her seat by the window, gazing out at the tarmac below. The guard was still there, looking small and insignificant against the backdrop of the jet. She allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. This was more than a moment of personal victory. It was a reminder, to herself and to anyone watching, that strength and success couldn't always be seen at a glance. They had to be earned, lived, and carried with quiet confidence. And Leela Hayes had done just that. The guard was still frozen in place, his mind racing. He could feel the stares of some nearby crew members and passengers who had begun to notice the scene. Their hushed whispers carried through the crisp morning air, adding to his growing sense of shame. Did you see what just happened? Someone muttered, their voice barely audible over the jet engines. Isn't that Leela Hayes, the CEO? Another whispered in disbelief. The guard's face burned red. He wished he could disappear, to undo the last 10 minutes of his life. But there was no escape, no way to change what had already unfolded. Meanwhile, Leela sat comfortably in her seat aboard the jet, her briefcase resting on the plush leather beside her. She leaned back, her calm demeanor unwavering, but her thoughts were sharp and deliberate. Moments like these were not new to her. Throughout her life, she had faced assumptions, judgments, and barriers from people who couldn't see past her appearance. Her phone buzzed softly on the armrest, breaking her train of thought. Picking it up, she saw a message from one of her assistants. Board meeting is confirmed for noon. Do you need anything before we begin? Leela typed back quickly. I'll be ready. Just make sure the presentation is finalized. Also, connect me with HR when I land. She placed the phone down and looked out the window. The jet began to move, taxiing smoothly toward the runway. From her vantage point, she could see the guard still standing where she had left him. He looked smaller now, almost insignificant against the vast expanse of the airport. But Leela didn't feel hatred or anger toward him. She felt pity. His actions were a reflection of deeper societal issues, ones that she had long worked to combat, not just for herself, but for others who faced similar challenges. As the jet lifted off, the ground below shrinking into a patchwork of runways and buildings, Leela allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought back to the journey that had brought her here, to this seat of power and privilege that many had tried to deny her. It hadn't always been like this. There was a time when Leela had been the one standing on the outside, looking in. She remembered her early days in business school, where she was often the only black woman in the room. The stares, the whispered comments, the endless need to prove herself, it had been exhausting. But Leela had never been one to give up. She had worked harder than anyone else, poring over case studies, acing exams, and volunteering for every leadership opportunity that came her way. Her professors had quickly noticed her sharp mind and unshakable determination. "You have something special, Leela," one of them had told her during her final year. "The world isn't always fair, but people like you, people who refuse to back down, you're the ones who change it." That advice had stayed with her, guiding her through every challenge that followed. After graduation, Leela had faced rejection after rejection from companies that couldn't see past her gender or race. But instead of letting it defeat her, she had taken a bold step. She started her own company. It hadn't been easy. She'd worked out of a tiny apartment, taking on small contracts and reinvesting every penny back into the business. Slowly but surely, her reputation grew. Clients admired her professionalism, her innovative ideas, and her ability to deliver results. Within a decade, Leela had turned her small startup into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. She had used her success to acquire struggling businesses, including the very airline she now owned. The memories faded as the jet reached cruising altitude. Leela opened her briefcase again, pulling out a stack of reports she needed to review before the meeting. But her mind kept drifting back to the incident with the guard. It wasn't the first time she had encountered prejudice, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But each time it happened, it served as a reminder of why she worked so hard, not just for herself, but for the countless others who face similar barriers. Her assistant's voice crackled over the intercom, pulling her from her thoughts. "Ms. Hayes, can I bring you anything?" Leela pressed the call button. "Just water, please," she replied. As the attendant brought her a glass of sparkling water, Leela noticed the respect in her demeanor. It was a stark contrast to the guard's behavior earlier, and it reinforced something Leela already knew. Respect was earned, but it should never have to be demanded. She sipped her water thoughtfully, her mind already planning her next steps. When she landed, she would address the incident directly. The guard's behavior wasn't just about her. It was about the culture he represented. And as the leader of the airline, it was her responsibility to ensure that such incidents were not repeated. Hours later, the jet touched down smoothly at its destination. Leela stepped out onto the tarmac, her coat billowing in the wind once again. This time, the crew was ready. A sleek black car awaited her, its driver standing by with the door open. As she slid into the car, her assistant greeted her with a stack of documents and a warm smile. "Welcome back, Ms. Hayes," they said. "Thank you," Leela replied, her voice calm but purposeful. "I'll need to speak with HR as soon as possible and schedule a meeting with the ground operations team." Her assistant nodded, making quick notes on a tablet. "Right away." Leela leaned back in her seat, her thoughts already shifting to the next steps. She knew that real change didn't happen overnight, but she was committed to making it happen, no matter how many obstacles stood in her way. The tension on the tarmac was palpable as Leela stood near the base of the stairs leading to her jet. The guard, still visibly shaken, fidgeted awkwardly, unsure of what to do next. He had been so confident just minutes ago, yet now he seemed smaller, his earlier arrogance evaporating in the weight of the moment. Within minutes, the guard's superior arrived, his brisk walk signaling that he understood the gravity of the situation. Dressed in a sharp navy blue uniform, the supervisor carried himself with an air of professionalism. His neatly clipped name badge read James Carter, Ground Operations Manager. He was a man used to dealing with problems efficiently, but the look on his face betrayed his concern. "Ms. Hayes," Carter said, approaching her with a polite but slightly nervous smile. He extended a hand. "I'm James Carter. I manage the ground operations here. I was informed there's been an issue." Leela shook his hand briefly, her grip firm. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Mr. Carter," she said, her tone calm but unyielding. "Yes, there has been an issue, and I believe it's one that speaks to a larger problem within this organization." Carter's smile faltered slightly, but he nodded. "I'm here to listen and address any concerns you have." Lila gestured toward the guard, who stood off to the side, his head lowered. "This gentleman," she began, her voice steady and deliberate, "made a series of assumptions about me based solely on how I look. He not only attempted to block me from boarding my own jet, but also dismissed me with blatant disrespect." Carter's brow furrowed as he turned to the guard. "Is this true?" he asked, his tone sharp. The guard stammered, his words tripping over each other. I didn't know who she was, sir. I thought she was just. I thought she didn't belong here." "And what gave you that impression?" Leela interjected, her voice cool but firm. "Was it my appearance? My skin? Or did you decide that someone like me couldn't possibly own this jet?" The guard's face turned bright red. I wasn't trying to." "Stop," Carter interrupted, holding up a hand. He took a deep breath, visibly trying to maintain his composure. "This is unacceptable behavior, and it goes against everything we stand for as an organization." Leela folded her arms, her gaze steady. "I've built this company on the principles of respect and equality," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority. "I won't tolerate discrimination toward me or anyone else." Carter nodded quickly. "Absolutely, Ms. Hayes. This behavior is inexcusable. I assure you, we will take immediate action." He turned to the guard, his expression stern. "You're relieved of your duties effective immediately. Hand over your badge and security credentials." The guard's eyes widened. "Please, sir," he pleaded, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean." "Enough," Carter said firmly. "Your actions have consequences. This is not up for discussion." Reluctantly, the guard reached for his badge, unpinning it from his uniform with shaking hands. His once arrogant demeanor was gone, replaced by visible shame. He handed the badge to Carter, his gaze fixed on the ground. As he was escorted away by another staff member, Leela watched silently. She felt no satisfaction in his humiliation, only a sense of resolve. This wasn't about punishing one person. It was about setting a standard for how everyone should be treated. With the issue resolved, Carter turned back to Leela. "Ms. Hayes, I want to personally apologize for what happened today. This is not reflective of the values we uphold as a company." "I appreciate your apology," Leela replied, her tone measured. "But an apology alone isn't enough. This incident highlights a deeper issue, one that needs to be addressed at every level of this organization." Carter nodded earnestly. "You're absolutely right. I'll be meeting with our HR team to review our training protocols and ensure that this kind of behavior is not tolerated moving forward." "Good," Leela said, "because if there's one thing I can't stand, it's a culture that allows people to be judged or dismissed based on assumptions. We need to do better, for our employees, for our customers, and for the future of this company." Carter's expression was serious as he nodded again. "I'll personally oversee these changes, Ms. Hayes. You have my word." Satisfied with his response, Leela allowed a small nod. "Thank you. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a flight to catch." "Of course," Carter said, stepping aside with a respectful gesture. "Safe travels, Mom." As Leela stepped onto the jet, the flight crew greeted her warmly, their smiles genuine. They knew exactly who she was and what she stood for, and their respect for her was evident in every gesture. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Hayes," the lead flight attendant said, bowing slightly. "We're honored to have you." Leila returned the smile, her demeanor softening. "Thank you. Let's get ready to take off." The door to the jet closed with a quiet hiss, sealing her away from the chaos on the tarmac. She settled into her seat, the luxurious leather molding to her form as she exhaled a long, slow breath. The tension of the morning began to melt away, replaced by a sense of clarity and determination. As the jet taxied down the runway, Leila looked out the window, watching the airport fade into the distance. The guard's actions had been a reminder of the work that still needed to be done, but she knew she was up to the challenge. This wasn't just about her. It was about creating a legacy of fairness, respect, and equality that would shape the future of her company and inspire others to do the same. The jet lifted off smoothly, climbing higher and higher into the clear blue sky. Leila leaned back in her seat, a faint smile playing on her lips. The incident on the tarmac was behind her now, but the lessons it carried would stay with her. Sometimes, she thought to herself, you have to face challenges head-on to make real change. And sometimes, those challenges remind you of just how far you've come. As the clouds parted below, revealing the sprawling landscape beneath her, Leila felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just running a company, she was building a better world, one decision at a time. As the jet climbed higher, the landscape below shrinking into an intricate patchwork, Leila found herself reflecting on the morning's events. She wasn't surprised by the guard's behavior. After all, she'd encountered prejudice in many forms throughout her life. But each time it happened, it reignited the fire in her soul. Her assistant's voice chimed softly over the intercom. "Ms. Hayes, would you like anything to drink or eat before we reach altitude?" "Just water for now, thank you," Leila responded. Her tone was warm but clipped, her mind clearly elsewhere. She stared out the window as the clouds swallowed the earth below. The blue skies ahead mirrored the clarity she sought. Leila had built her airline on principles that directly opposed what she had faced that morning. She prided herself on fostering inclusivity and respect, and today's incident showed her that the work was far from finished. Her phone vibrated gently on the armrest. Picking it up, she saw a message from the head of HR. "Ms. Hayes, I've been informed about the incident. We're gathering a full report and scheduling a review session for ground operations staff. Please let us know if there's anything specific you'd like addressed." Leila's reply was concise. "Thank you. Let's make this a priority. Set up quarterly sensitivity training for all departments, starting with ground staff. I'll speak to the team directly when I return." Setting the phone down, Leila let her fingers rest lightly on the leather folder beside her. The embossed letters of her name shimmered faintly in the sunlight streaming through the window. The guard's face flashed briefly in her memory, not the arrogance of his earlier demeanor, but the shame that had taken its place. It wasn't satisfaction she felt. It was a quiet determination to use the experience to spark change. When the jet touched down at its destination, Leila stepped out onto another private tarmac, where a sleek black car awaited her. Her driver, Marcus, greeted her with a warm smile as he opened the door. "Welcome back, Ms. Hayes," he said, tipping his cap slightly. "Thank you, Marcus," Leila replied, sliding into the car. "Straight to headquarters, please. We have a lot to discuss today." The car ride was smooth, the city skyline coming into view as they neared the towering building that housed the airline's corporate offices. As the car pulled up to the entrance, her assistant, Julia, was already waiting by the glass doors with a tablet in hand. "Good afternoon, Ms. Hayes," Julia said, falling into step beside her as they entered the building. "The HR team is ready for your meeting, and I've scheduled time with the ground operations leadership afterward." "Perfect," Leila said. "Let's make sure the message is clear." Inside the sleek conference room, the HR team sat ready, their expressions a mix of determination and concern. Leila entered the room with her usual calm confidence, setting her briefcase on the table as she addressed the team. "I'm sure you've all been briefed on what happened this morning," she began, her tone firm but measured. "What transpired on the tarmac wasn't just an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a deeper problem, and it's our responsibility to fix it." The head of HR, a sharp-eyed woman named Denise, nodded. "We've reviewed the preliminary report, Ms. Hayes. It's clear that the guard's behavior was unacceptable, and we've already initiated termination procedures." Leela held up a hand. "That's a start, but it's not enough. This isn't just about one person. This is about ensuring that every employee understands and embodies the values this company stands for. Discrimination, in any form, has no place here." Denise leaned forward, her voice thoughtful. "I couldn't agree more. We've begun drafting plans for mandatory sensitivity training for all staff. We're also revisiting our hiring practices and onboarding processes to reinforce our commitment to inclusivity from day one." Leela nodded, pleased. "Good. Let's also implement ongoing workshops, not just one-time training sessions. These lessons need to be reinforced consistently, not treated as an afterthought." Another HR representative chimed in. "We can include anonymous feedback tools to ensure employees feel safe reporting concerns or incidents without fear of retaliation." "Excellent idea," Leela said. "Let's make that happen. I want a culture where every employee feels respected and valued, whether they're on the tarmac, in the cockpit, or in this boardroom." The team nodded in unison, their energy matching Leela's resolve. Later that afternoon, Leela stood in front of the ground operations team, a gathering of supervisors and key staff members from various departments. Her presence commanded attention as she began to speak. "I want to start by saying this. You are the backbone of this company," she said, her tone genuine. "Without your hard work and dedication, none of what we achieve as an airline would be possible." She paused, letting her words settle. "But with that responsibility comes the need for accountability. What happened this morning on the tarmac was a failure, not just of one individual, but of the culture we've allowed to exist. That ends today." The room was silent, all eyes on her. "This isn't about punishment," she continued. "It's about growth. We're implementing new training programs, creating clearer policies, and fostering an environment where respect is non-negotiable. That's what I expect from every one of you." A supervisor raised his hand. "Ms. Hayes, thank you for addressing this so directly. What can we, as leaders, do to support these changes?" "Lead by example," Leela said without hesitation. "Show your teams what respect looks like in action. Hold yourself and others accountable. And above all, listen. Every voice in this company matters, and it's up to us to make sure they're heard." The room erupted into applause, not the loud, obligatory kind, but the heartfelt acknowledgement of a leader they admired and respected. As the day came to a close, Leela sat in her office, gazing out at the city skyline. The day's events had been exhausting, but they had also been necessary. Progress wasn't easy, but it was always worth it. Her phone buzzed with a message from Julia. "Ground operations team appreciated your speech. Feedback has been overwhelmingly positive." Leela smiled, typing back. "Good. This is just the beginning." She leaned back in her chair, the weight of responsibility heavy on her shoulders, but her resolve stronger than ever. Challenges like the one she faced that morning were reminders of why she worked so hard, to build a world where respect and equality weren't ideals but realities. From the comfort of her seat, Leela gazed out at the endless expanse of clouds. The world below was a distant memory, tucked away beneath layers of soft white and the hum of the jet's engines. Up here, everything seemed smaller. The buildings, the roads, even the problems that had once felt insurmountable. Leela's thoughts were steady, yet they carried the weight of the morning's events. She had faced prejudice before. She had encountered people who judged her before they knew her, who underestimated her because of her skin, her gender, or the way she carried herself. Yet, every time, she had risen above it. Sometimes, she mused silently, the greatest power lies in staying composed when others expect you to crumble. She thought back to the guard's face when he realized his mistake. How quickly his smug confidence had turned to panic, how the arrogance in his tone had been replaced by shame. Lila didn't feel satisfaction from his downfall. She felt purpose. His reaction wasn't just about her. It was a mirror reflecting the biases that still existed in the world. But she had chosen not to crumble. She had chosen to stand tall, to let her strength speak louder than her words. And that was a choice she would make every single time. As the jet climbed higher, Layla's mind wandered to her younger self. She remembered a time when staying composed hadn't come so easily. She had been 23, fresh out of college, and eager to prove herself. Her first job interview was for a prestigious firm. She had prepared for days, studying every detail about the company, rehearsing her answers, and making sure her appearance was impeccable. But when she walked into the room, the interviewer barely looked at her resume. Instead, he had leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly as he spoke. "You're very impressive," he had said, though his tone lacked sincerity. "But you might find it hard to fit into our culture here. It's different from what you're probably used to." At the time, his words had stung. She had left the interview feeling small, questioning whether she would ever find a place where she belonged. But that moment had also ignited something in her, a fire that would never be extinguished. She had promised herself that day that she wouldn't let anyone's assumptions define her. Instead, she would prove them wrong. Leela's quiet smile returned as she thought about that promise she had made to herself all those years ago. She had kept it, not just for her younger self, but for every person who had ever been made to feel less than they were. "Let them underestimate me," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the steady hum of the engines. "They'll never see me coming." The words felt like a mantra, one she had lived by time and time again. Her phone buzzed softly beside her, pulling her from her thoughts. Picking it up, she saw a message from Denise, the head of HR. "The first draft of the training program is ready. Looking forward to your feedback." Layla quickly typed a reply.